The summer of 1944 hung heavy over the city of Warsaw. It was a stifling, humid heat that seemed to trap the dust of 5 years of occupation against the cobblestones. To an outsider observing from the banks of the Vistula River, the city might have appeared as it had for half a decade, a gray, subdued metropolis under the iron heel of the Third Reich. But for those walking the streets, for the shopkeepers, the tram drivers, and the students hurrying with heads down past German patrols, the air was vibrating with something other than heat. It was the frantic, electric tension of an approaching storm. To the east, barely 10 miles away across the flat Mazovian plains, the horizon flickered with the artificial lightning of artillery. The deep, rolling thunder of Soviet guns had become a constant backdrop to daily life, a sonic reminder that the German war machine, once invincible, was retreating. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive, had shattered the German Army Group Center. The Wehrmacht was broken, bleeding, and pulling back in disarray. Columns of dusty, exhausted German soldiers, their uniforms torn and eyes hollow, had been seen trudging through Warsaw from east to west, a sight that ignited a dangerous hope in the hearts of the Polish population. For 5 years, Warsaw had been the epicenter of Polish resistance. It was a city of shadows. Underneath the visible surface of German decrees and curfews, a second state existed. The Polish underground state was not merely a resistance group. It was a fully functioning government in exile, complete with courts, schools, and most importantly, an army. The Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, commanded by General Tadeusz Komorowski, had been preparing for this moment since the dark days of 1939. They had waited, stockpiled, trained in secret basements, and watched as the geopolitics of the war shifted around them. Now, in late July 1944, the leadership faced an agonizing dilemma. If they sat still and waited for the Red Army to liberate them, they would likely exchange one occupier for another, allowing Stalin to install a communist puppet government and claim that the Polish resistance had done nothing. But if they rose up and liberated their own capital before the Russians arrived, they could welcome the Soviets as hosts in a free Poland, asserting their sovereignty and legitimacy. It was a gamble of the highest stakes, played with the lives of nearly 1 million civilians and 40,000 ill-equipped soldiers. The order was given on July 31st. The date for the uprising was set for August 1st, 1944. The time was designated as Hour W, 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The choice of daylight was tactical. It would allow the insurgents to blend into the evening rush hour crowds to reach their mobilization points, and then give them a few hours of daylight to secure objectives before the cover of darkness allowed them to consolidate defenses. As the sun climbed high on the morning of August 1st, the city was a hive of clandestine activity. To the German garrison, comprising roughly 15,000 heavily armed troops initially, the day seemed tense but manageable. They were aware of the unrest. Governor Ludwig Fischer had even ordered 100,000 Polish men to report for fortification duties a few days prior, an order that was almost universally ignored, but they did not anticipate the scale of what was coming. Beneath their noses, the machinery of the Home Army was grinding into gear. Young men and women, many barely out of their teens, kissed their mothers goodbye, often without saying where they were going or if they would return. They slipped out of apartments wearing long trench coats despite the summer warmth, coats that concealed pistols, grenades, and armbands. The mobilization was chaotic. The city was divided into districts, and thousands of conspirators had to move weapons from secret caches to their assembly points. This was a logistical nightmare in an occupied city swarming with patrols. There were incidents before the appointed hour. In the district of Zalibors, a clash with a German patrol occurred early in the afternoon, alerting some local commanders, but the general alarm was not raised. The Germans remained dangerously complacent, trusting in the sheer firepower of their machine guns and tanks against a population they viewed as subhuman. The weaponry available to the insurgents was pitiable. Of the 40,000 soldiers mobilizing, barely 1 in 10 had a firearm. The rest were armed with homemade weapons, iron bars, or simply the hope of picking up a rifle from a fallen enemy. They had British Sten guns dropped by air in previous months, captured German Mossers, and the locally manufactured Bliskowicza submachine guns, assembled in secret workshops. But their most ubiquitous weapon was the bottle. Thousands of glass bottles filled with gasoline and thickening agents, Molotov cocktails, were crated and ready. Against the armor of the panzer divisions, these fragile glass grenades were the primary anti-tank defense. As the church clocks began to chime the hour of 5, the heavens opened. A light rain began to fall, turning the dust into a slick film on the streets. At 1700 hours exactly, the city exploded. It was not a single, unified blast, but a synchronized eruption across the entire capital. Windows were thrown open, and submachine gun fire rained down on German patrols. Grenades were lobbed from doorways into passing trucks. The red and white flag of Poland, banned for 5 years, was suddenly unfurled from balconies and rooftops, the colors stark against the gray stone. Young men and women pulled on their white and red armbands, transforming instantly from civilians into soldiers of the Republic. In the city center, the fighting was immediate and ferocious. The main goal was to seize key strategic buildings: the telephone exchange, the main post office, the power station, and the police headquarters. The element of surprise was the Home Army's greatest asset, and in many sectors it worked. German sentries, caught off guard, were overwhelmed before they could reach their heavy weapons. The Prudential Building, the tallest skyscraper in Warsaw and a symbol of the city's pre-war modernity, was captured quickly. The Polish flag was hoisted to its summit, visible for miles, a beacon that signaled to the entire city that the fight had begun. However, the reality of urban warfare quickly set in. The Germans, though surprised, were disciplined veterans. They retreated into fortified bunkers and concrete strongpoints, turning buildings into fortresses. The Home Army, lacking heavy artillery and explosives, found themselves pinning down the enemy but unable to dislodge them. The attacks on the critical Vistula bridges, vital for connecting the city to the approaching Soviets and for preventing German reinforcements, failed. The bridges remained in German hands, heavily defended by machine gun nests that cut down the lightly armed insurgents charging across the open ground. Similarly, the attacks on the Oksy Airport and the University District were repelled with heavy losses. The open spaces of the airfield were killing grounds for the Home Army soldiers, who had little cover against the sweeping fire of German flak guns leveled at the ground. By nightfall on that first day, the situation was a complex patchwork. The Home Army controlled large swaths of the city center, the Old Town, and the residential districts of Mokotów and Zalibórz. But the Germans held firm to the strategic arteries, the train lines, and the bridges. The city was not liberated, it was divided. As darkness fell on August 1st, the rain intensified. The city was illuminated by the orange glow of burning buildings. The sounds of battle changed. The sharp cracks of rifles were replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of German heavy machine guns and the terrifying screech of the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, which the Poles would soon nickname the Screaming Cow for the distinct, horrifying sound the rockets made as they tore through the air. For the civilians of Warsaw, the first night was a mixture of euphoria and terror. After 5 years of whispering, of walking in the gutter, of fearing the knock at the door, the streets were suddenly theirs again. People rushed out to build barricades. This was a total mobilization of the population. Grandmothers, children, and shopkeepers tore up paving stones, overturned trams, and piled furniture into the streets to create defensive walls. The barricade became the symbol of the uprising, a physical manifestation of the city's refusal to yield. But with the euphoria came the realization that the Germans were not running. They were regrouping. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, received the news of the uprising not with fear, but with a cold, genocidal opportunism. He went to Hitler and declared that this was a blessing. It was an opportunity to solve the Polish problem once and for all. The order was given. Warsaw was to be razed to the ground. Every inhabitant was to be killed. No prisoners were to be taken. The city was to disappear from the map of Europe. To execute this order, the Germans did not initially send regular Wehrmacht frontline troops, who were desperately needed to hold the line against the Soviets. Instead, they scraped together a horrifying menagerie of police units, SS penal brigades, and collaborationist formations. Among these units were the Durluanger Brigade and the Kamiński Brigade. The Durluanger unit was composed of convicted poachers, murderers, and rapists released from German prisons, led by Oskar Durluanger, a man of such cruelty that even other SS officers shunned him. The Kamiński Brigade was a chaotic force of Russian collaborators, known for their brutality and looting. These were the forces that began to converge on Warsaw in the days following the outbreak. By the 3rd and 4th of August, the front lines had solidified. The Home Army, realizing that a quick victory was impossible without Soviet help, shifted to a defensive posture. They fortified the buildings they had captured, creating a labyrinth of passages through cellars and courtyards. To move through the streets was suicide due to German snipers, so the Poles went underground or through the walls. They broke holes in the partition walls between terraced houses, creating mouse holes that allowed couriers and soldiers to travel entire city blocks without ever stepping outside. The logistics of the uprising were a marvel of improvisation. A city of 1 million people had to be fed and watered while under siege. The Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, the Grey Ranks, became the lifeline of the insurrection. Children as young as 10 and 12 served as couriers, darting through the sewers and under barricades to deliver messages and ammunition. They organized a field postal service, collecting letters from civilians and delivering them across the divided districts, maintaining the morale of families separated by the fighting. Kitchens were set up in courtyards where massive pots of barley soup, the staple diet of the uprising, were cooked over open fires. The German counterattack, when it began in earnest on August 5th, was focused on the Wola district in the west. The intention was to drive a wedge through the city to reach the Vistula bridges and reconnect the German lines of communication. What happened in Wola was not a battle, it was a massacre. The units under General Rienefarth and Durluanger moved house by house, street by street, executing the standing orders to kill everyone. They did not distinguish between insurgents and civilians. They threw grenades into cellars packed with women and children. They dragged hospital patients from their beds and shot them in the courtyards. The scale of the Wola massacre remains difficult to comprehend. In the span of a few days, an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 civilians were murdered in cold blood. The piles of bodies were so great that the Germans formed the Verbrenungskommando, a unit of captive Polish men forced to burn the corpses of their neighbors on massive pyres to prevent the spread of disease. The smoke from Wola drifted over the rest of the city, a dark, greasy fog that carried the sickening stench of death. It was a message to the rest of Warsaw. Surrender meant extinction. But rather than breaking the spirit of the defenders, the news from Wola hardened it. The Home Army soldiers fighting in the old town and the city center realized there was no going back. They were fighting not just for victory, but for survival and for a death with dignity. The resistance stiffened. Every building became a fortress. In the narrow streets of the old town, the medieval architecture became a trap for German armor. When a tank rumbled down the cobblestones, insurgents would wait until it was directly beneath their windows before dropping Molotov cocktails on the rear engine vent. The crews would burn or be cut down as they tried to escape. The Germans, frustrated by the tenacity of the defense, turned to heavy technology. They brought in the Goliath-tracked mines, small, remote-controlled miniature tanks filled with explosives. They would steer these into barricades or the foundations of strongpoints and detonate them, bringing whole facades crashing down. They also employed the Karl Jarret, a massive siege mortar that fired a 2-ton shell. When a shell from the Karl Jarret hit a tenement building, the building didn't just collapse. It disintegrated into a cloud of red brick dust, burying everyone inside in seconds. The air war was entirely one-sided. The Luftwaffe operated with impunity. Stuka dive bombers circled lazily overhead, picking their targets. The terrifying scream of their sirens as they entered a dive was a psychological weapon as potent as the bombs themselves. They targeted the waterworks, the power plants, and the hospitals. By the second week, the city was losing power and running out of water. The insurgents and civilians were forced to dig wells in courtyards, digging through the rubble and sand, often under mortar fire, desperately seeking clean water. Despite the carnage, life in the liberated sectors developed a surreal normality. Underground newspapers were printed daily, providing news from the front and transcripts of radio broadcasts from London. Theaters put on poetry readings in basements. There were even weddings. In the midst of the shelling, amidst the dust and the fear, couples exchanged vows, often wearing armbands over their civilian clothes, with a ring made from a piece of brass or copper wire. These moments of humanity were acts of defiance as powerful as any gunshot. They asserted that civilization still existed in the face of barbarism. As August turned to mid-month, the eyes of Warsaw turned constantly to the sky and to the river. Where were the Soviets? The Red Army held positions on the east bank of the Vistula, in the suburb of Praga. They were so close that the insurgents could see the flashes of their guns. But the offensive had stopped. Stalin, calculating and ruthless, claimed that the uprising was a criminal adventure, launched without his coordination. He refused to allow Allied planes, flying from bases in Italy and Britain, to land on Soviet-held airfields to refuel after dropping supplies to Warsaw. This meant that British, South African, and Polish pilots flying from Brindisi in Italy had to make a round trip of over 1,500 miles over enemy territory. The Allied airdrops were the only lifeline, but they were tragically insufficient. Flying low over the burning city in heavy 4-engine Halifax and Liberator bombers, the crews braved a wall of German anti-aircraft fire to drop canisters of weapons and ammunition. Many planes were lost. The tragedy was that because the drop zones were small and surrounded by German positions, many of the canisters drifted into enemy hands. The insurgents would watch with breaking hearts as parachutes carrying desperate supplies floated down into German-held squares. In the Old Town, the situation was becoming critical. Cut off from the city center and the river, the defenders were squeezed into an area of less than 1 square mile. The Germans pounded the district day and night. The beautiful Renaissance market square was reduced to a landscape of jagged ruins. The cellars, crowded with thousands of wounded and civilians, became suffocating traps. The medical staff worked without anesthetics, performing amputations with hacksaws by the light of carbide lamps, while the walls shook from the impacts of heavy artillery. It was here in the Old Town that the sewers became the primary mode of transport. The Connolly, as they were known, were a dark, stinking underworld that terrified the Germans. The insurgents used them to move troops between the isolated districts. It was a journey through hell. The tunnels were narrow, often less than 3 feet high, forcing men to crawl through raw sewage that rose to their chests. The air was thick with methane and the fumes of decomposing waste. There was total darkness, broken only by the occasional beam of a flashlight. The Germans, realizing this, began to throw grenades down the manholes and lower gas canisters to suffocate those inside. To travel the sewers was a test of psychological endurance that broke many. Yet it was the only way to evacuate the wounded and the retreating soldiers from the dying old town to the city center. By the end of August, the old town had fallen. The evacuation through the sewers was one of the most dramatic episodes of the uprising. Thousands of soldiers and lightly wounded slipped down the manholes, leaving behind the severely wounded who could not be moved. The rearguard fought to the last bullet to buy time. When the Germans finally entered the ruins of the old town, they found only rubble and the dead. The heart of the resistance had migrated, flowing through the veins of the city to continue the fight in the center. The narrative of the uprising is not just one of fighting, but of waiting. Waiting in the dark cellars while the building above groaned under the shelling. Waiting for the water ration, a cup of muddy liquid that had to last a day. Waiting for the news from London that never seemed to bring the promised deliverance. The civilians, initially enthusiastic, were beginning to suffer from starvation. The barley soup was thinning. Cats, dogs, and horses had long since been eaten. People began to boil wallpaper to eat the paste. Dysentery and typhus began to spread in the crowded, unsanitary basements. Yet the discipline of the Home Army held. The structure of command remained intact. They produced their own weapons, including the Filipinka and Sidaloka hand grenades, manufactured in underground workshops. They even built an armored car named Cubus, built on the chassis of a Chevrolet truck and covered in steel plates, which was used in attempts to storm the university. The ingenuity of the Poles was limitless, driven by the necessity of survival. In the southern district of Mokotów, the fighting took on a different character. Here, the garden suburbs allowed for a more fluid battle, but the German pressure was relentless. The insurgents held out in the crumbling villas and parks, facing experienced panzer grenadiers. The isolation of the districts meant that each sector fought its own war, connected only by the sewers and the fragile radio links. As September arrived, the weather began to turn. The heat of August gave way to cooler winds, blowing the dust and the smell of burning across the plains. The days were growing shorter, and still the Soviets did not cross the river. On the east bank, the Red Army watched. They watched the fires burn. They heard the screams of the city. For the soldiers of the Home Army, the betrayal was becoming clear. They were not just fighting the Germans, they were being allowed to die by their allies. The realization was a bitter poison, but it did not stop the fighting. If anything, it gave the resistance a fatalistic determination. They would fight because there was no other choice. They would fight for history. The German forces, now commanded by General Erich von dem Bock-Zelewski, who had replaced the ineffective commanders of the early days, began to methodically slice the city into smaller pockets. Bock-Zelewski was a brutal pragmatist. He realized that infantry assaults in the ruins were too costly, so he relied on overwhelming firepower to level a block before sending in troops to mop up. He offered ultimatums to the civilians to leave the city, promising fair treatment, a lie that many, in their desperation and hunger, began to consider. The exodus of civilians from the ruins began, thousands shuffling out of the city with their hands up, carrying their few remaining possessions, walking past the German lines into an uncertain future of labor camps or worse. But the core of the Home Army remained. In the city center, they held the line along Jerusalem Avenue, the main east-west artery. Maintaining control of a crossing point across this avenue was vital to keep the northern and southern parts of the center connected. The crossing was under constant German machine gun fire. To cross it, the insurgents built a trench, barricaded with sandbags and paving stones. It was the lifeline of the uprising, a narrow ditch through which couriers, ammunition, and orders flowed. The technological disparity was nowhere more evident than in the Goliath attacks. These small, tracked vehicles would buzz towards the Polish lines like angry insects. The defenders learned that if they could cut the control wire that trailed behind the machine, it would stop dead. Brave young soldiers would leap from cover under fire to sever the wire with shears or even shovels, disabling the explosive charge. It was a David and Goliath struggle in the most literal sense. In the Powyle district, along the riverbank, the fight was for access to the Vistula. The insurgents hoped that if they could hold the riverbank, the Soviets might send boats across. For a brief moment in mid-September, hope flared again. The First Polish Army, fighting under Soviet command, was finally allowed to attempt a landing. These were Polish soldiers, desperate to help their countrymen. Without adequate Soviet artillery support or landing craft, they tried to cross the river in pontoons and makeshift boats. They landed in Powyle and Cherniakow, joining the starving insurgents. But they were pinned down on the narrow bridgehead. The Germans concentrated massive fire on the river crossings. The supplies couldn't get through. The landings failed. The soldiers from the East Bank died alongside the home army soldiers, their bodies left on the muddy banks of the Vistula. This failure marked the psychological turning point. The realization settled in that no rescue was coming. The failure of the river landings in mid-September 1944 was the death knell for the uprising, though the fighting would drag on for another 2 agonizing weeks. The Cherniakow district, clinging to the western bank of the Vistula, became a slaughterhouse. The Polish soldiers from the First Army, the Berlingausi, who had managed to cross the river, found themselves in a tactical nightmare. They were regular infantry, trained for open-field combat on the Eastern Front, not for the three-dimensional hell of urban warfare in a ruined city. They were bewildered by the labyrinth of cellars and attics. They had expected to link up with a substantial force and push forward. Instead, they found starving partisans in rags, clutching Sten guns and desperate for ammunition. The Germans, realizing the danger of a Soviet foothold on the West Bank, threw everything they had at the narrow strip of land in Cherniakow. They deployed their elite Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The battle became a contest for individual rooms and staircases. The relentless artillery fire pulverized the few remaining buildings into mounds of brick and plaster. The smoke was so thick that day became indistinguishable from night. For the wounded lying in the basements, there was no evacuation. The hospitals were targeted systematically. In one incident on Wilanowska Street, the Germans stormed a field hospital and executed the wounded where they lay, along with the nurses who refused to leave them. By September 23rd, the Cherniakow bridgehead had collapsed. The few surviving soldiers from the East Bank tried to swim back across the freezing, bullet-swept Vistula. Most were cut down by machine gun fire or drowned, weighed down by their heavy Soviet tissue coats and boots. The home army soldiers who remained in the district fought to the last cartridge. When the ammunition ran out, the end was brutal. The survivors were rounded up. The Germans, identifying the Berlingausi by their green uniforms, often shot them on the spot as traitors, while the home army soldiers were marched off to an uncertain fate. The fall of the river district severed the last physical link to the outside world. The city was now a sealed tomb. As the perimeter of the uprising shrank, the German noose tightened around the southern district of Mokotów. This district, known for its parks and elegant villas, had held out for weeks in relative isolation. But with the river secured, General von dem Bachzelewski turned his full attention south. The attack on Mokotów began on September 24th. It was preceded by a hurricane of artillery fire that stripped the leaves from the trees and turned the manicured gardens into lunar landscapes. The defense of Mokotów was fierce but brief. The insurgents were low on ammunition and exhausted. The psychological toll of the failed Soviet intervention hung heavy over them. By September 26th, the command was given to evacuate. Once again, the sewers were the only escape route. But unlike the disciplined, orderly withdrawal from the old town weeks earlier, the evacuation of Mokotów descended into chaos. Thousands of civilians and soldiers crowded the entrances to the manholes. The panic was palpable. The sewers here were smaller, the sludge deeper. In the darkness, discipline broke down. People got lost in the branching tunnels, wandering in circles until their flashlights died, and they were left in the suffocating blackness to wait for the end. The Germans had learned the geography of the underground by now. They opened manholes along the route and threw down gas grenades and carbide, which reacted with the damp air to create blinding, choking fumes. They built barriers of sandbags inside the tunnels to block the flow, causing the sewage to rise to the necks of those wading through it. Those who emerged from the sewers in the city center were unrecognizable. They were covered in a thick black slime, gasping for air, their eyes wide with the horror of what they had seen and left behind underground. But many did not emerge. At Dworkowa Street, a group of insurgents, disoriented and desperate, climbed out of a manhole straight into the waiting arms of the German police. They were not taken prisoner. Dozens were lined up against the nearest wall and shot, their bodies tumbling back into the open manhole or left on the pavement as a warning. With the fall of Makoto and shortly after the northern district of Zaliborz on September 30th, the uprising was reduced to a small, ragged pocket in the city center, the Esa. This area, no more than a few square miles of shattered masonry, was packed with hundreds of thousands of civilians and the remnants of the Home Army. The conditions in the city center during those final days of late September and early October were beyond medieval. There was no running water. There was no electricity. There was no food. The barley soup was gone. People were subsisting on spoons of sugar or rancid oil. The civilians lived entirely in the cellars, a subterranean society that had reverted to the Stone Age. They huddled in the dark, listening to the thumping of the artillery, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. The air in the cellars was foul, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, gangrene, and fear. Apathy began to set in. The initial enthusiasm of August, the patriotic fervor, had been ground down by 60 days of relentless bombardment. Civilians, once supportive of the soldiers, now looked at them with hollow, accusing eyes. "Why are you still fighting?" they would whisper. "They will kill us all." Mothers clutched babies who had stopped crying because they were too weak to make a sound. The specter of epidemic disease, typhus and dysentery, stalked the overcrowded basements, killing as efficiently as German bullets. The Home Army Command faced a terrible choice. They had enough ammunition for perhaps 2 or 3 days of light skirmishing. They had no heavy weapons. The food stocks were exhausted. The Soviets were silent across the river. To continue fighting would mean the total biological annihilation of the city's population. General Tadeusz Komorowski, the commander of the Home Army, realized that further resistance was not heroism. It was suicide. On October 1st, a ceasefire was arranged to allow civilians to leave the city. The Germans, eager to clear the battlefield for the final destruction, paused the shelling. For the first time in 2 months, a strange, ringing silence fell over Warsaw. It was a silence that hurt the ears. The civilians emerged from their holes like ghosts. They were pale, emaciated, covered in gray dust. They blinked in the autumn sunlight, shielding their eyes. The exodus began. It was a river of human misery flowing out of the city. Women carrying bundles of rags that contained their entire lives. Men supporting the wounded. Elderly people pushing wheelbarrows with a few salvaged books or family photos. They walked past the German checkpoints, where soldiers in field gray watched them with indifference. They were heading for the transit camp at Pruskow, from where they would be sent to labor camps in the Reich or to concentration camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. The city was being emptied of its soul. While the civilians left, the negotiations for the capitulation of the army took place at the German headquarters in Ozero, just outside the city. The Polish negotiators, General Komorowski and his staff, walked out to meet General von dem Bachzelewski. They were tattered, unshaven, and exhausted, yet they carried themselves with a rigid, icy dignity. They demanded that the Home Army soldiers be treated as combatants under the Geneva Convention, not as bandits or rebels to be executed. Surprisingly, the Germans agreed. Von dem Bachzelewski, sensing the war was turning against Germany and perhaps looking to his own future prosecution, wanted a clean end to the battle. He accorded the Polish officers full military honors. The capitulation was signed on October 2, 1944. The fighting officially ended at 2000 hours, 8 o'clock in the evening. The next day, the surrender of the Home Army began. It was a scene of heartbreaking tragedy and pride. The soldiers formed up in their units amidst the ruins of the streets they had defended for 63 days. They did not look like a defeated army. They marched in formation, their heads held high. They wore a motley assortment of uniforms, captured German tunics, pre-war Polish jackets, civilian coats with armbands, but they marched in step. As they marched towards the German lines to lay down their arms, they sang. They sang the Polish national anthem, "Poland is not yet lost." They sang the songs of the uprising, "The Heart in the Backpack" and "Warsaw Children." The sound echoed off the skeletons of the burned-out buildings. Many of the soldiers wept openly as they piled their weapons into heaps. These were the rifles they had captured with their bare hands, the Sten guns dropped from the sky, the pistols they had hidden for 5 years. Surrendering them felt like cutting off a limb. The Germans watched in silence. There was a grudging respect in the eyes of the Wehrmacht veterans. They had fought in France, in Russia, in Africa, but they had never encountered an enemy quite like this. An army of amateurs, of children and students who had held off the might of the German war machine for 2 months with little more than courage and gasoline bottles. As the columns of Polish prisoners of war marched out of the city, heading towards the captivity of the German stalags, they looked back at Warsaw. The city was dead. The smoke was still rising from 1,000 fires. The streets were empty, save for the corpses that still lay unburied and the packs of abandoned dogs roaming the rubble. The silence was absolute. The heartbeat of the capital had stopped, but the tragedy of Warsaw was not over. The surrender marked the end of the fighting, but it signaled the beginning of the destruction. Hitler was furious that the city had resisted for so long. His orders remained in effect. Warsaw must be erased. It was to be an example to the rest of Europe. After the last civilians and soldiers were driven out, the brand commandos, special burning detachments, moved in. This was not the chaotic destruction of battle. This was cold, industrial demolition. The city was divided into sectors, and the German units moved systematically from building to building. They were not looking for enemies, they were looking for architecture. They drilled holes in the walls of palaces, libraries, and museums, inserting dynamite charges. They used flamethrowers to ignite the interiors of churches that had survived the bombing. They targeted the cultural heart of the nation. The Saxon Palace, the residence of Polish kings, was blown into the air. The National Museum, the archives, the great libraries holding centuries of literature, all were torched. The statues of poets and generals were toppled and melted down. For 3 months, from October 1944 until January 1945, the Germans worked with efficient malice to level what remained of Warsaw. They destroyed house after house, block after block. It was a vindictive attempt to murder the memory of a nation. By the time they were finished, 85% of the city was destroyed. The old town was a sea of bricks. The city center was a flat wasteland where the wind howled through the twisted rebar. On the east bank of the Vistula, the Red Army sat and waited. They waited through the autumn rains. They waited through the first snows of winter. Only in January 1945, when the Germans had largely withdrawn and the city was a frozen graveyard, did the Soviets finally cross the river. When the Soviet soldiers entered Warsaw on January 17, 1945, they entered a lunar landscape. There were no cheering crowds to greet them. There were no flowers. There was only the silence of the ruins and the smell of wet ash. The snow covered the mounds of rubble, smoothing out the jagged edges of the destruction, making the city look like a vast, white desert. The few Robinson Crusoes, the handful of people who had hidden in the deepest bunkers and ruins, refusing to leave with the civilian exodus, crawled out to meet the liberators. They were living skeletons, half-mad from isolation and hunger. They emerged into a city that no longer existed. The street signs were gone. The landmarks were gone. To find one's way, one had to navigate by the shape of the ruined piles. The Warsaw Uprising was a military defeat, but it was a moral victory of staggering proportions. It demonstrated to the world and to the future generations of Poles that the spirit of freedom could not be extinguished by tanks or terror. The cost was unimaginable. Nearly 200,000 civilians dead, 15,000 soldiers killed, and a capital city wiped from the face of the earth. The story of the uprising is often told as a tragedy of betrayal, betrayed by the Soviets who watched it die, and by the Western allies who could not, or would not, do enough to save it. But it is also a story of the human capacity for endurance. It is the story of the 19-year-old courier girl running through a storm of bullets to deliver a letter. It is the story of the mechanic building a submachine gun in a cellar by candlelight. It is the story of a city that chose to die standing up rather than to live on its knees. Today, if you walk the streets of Warsaw, you are walking on a city built upon a city. The rubble of 1944 was used to make the concrete for the reconstruction. The blood of the insurgents is, quite literally, in the foundations of the modern capital. Every year on August 1st at exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon, hour W, the sirens wail across the city. The trams stop, the cars stop, the pedestrians freeze in place. For 1 minute, the modern bustle ceases, and the city remembers. It remembers the silence before the storm. It remembers the hope. It remembers the fire. This minute of silence is the final chapter of the story, written not in ink, but in the collective memory of a people. The uprising did not free Warsaw in 1944, but the memory of the uprising helped to keep the dream of a free Poland alive through the long, gray decades of communist domination that followed. In the end, the city rose again, not because of the geopolitical calculations of superpowers, but because of the stubborn, invincible will of its inhabitants, who returned to the ruins in 1945 and began, with their bare hands, to clear the bricks and rebuild their home. The story of Warsaw is a testament to the fact that a city is more than bricks and mortar. A city is its people, its history, and its spirit, and that the Germans could not destroy. To understand the full magnitude of what happened after the guns fell silent in October 1944, one must visualize the landscape of the capital in the deep winter of early 1945. Warsaw was no longer a city in the conventional sense. It was a geological formation of man-made debris. The Germans had executed their demolition orders with a terrifying thoroughness. They had not just knocked down walls, they had systematically blown up the foundations. The streets were canyons filled with 20 feet of rubble. The recognizable grid of the city had been erased, replaced by a chaotic topography of brick dunes and twisted steel valleys. In this frozen wasteland, buried under a shroud of heavy snow, lay the unburied dead, preserved by the bitter cold, waiting for the return of the living. But the city was not entirely empty. In the bowels of this necropolis, life flickered in the dark. These were the Robinson Crusoes of Warsaw. They were the few hundred, perhaps 1,000, individuals who had refused to surrender, or who had escaped the transport columns and hidden themselves in the deepest, most inaccessible ruins. For 3 months, from October to January, they lived a feral existence. They were Jews who knew that surrender meant the gas chambers. They were home army soldiers who feared execution. They were civilians who simply could not bear to leave their homes. Their life was a nightmare of silence and cold. To make a sound was to die, for the Germans left behind patrols and listening posts specifically to hunt these survivors. They lived in bunkers camouflaged with rubble, sleeping on rotting mattresses wrapped in rags. Water was the greatest obsession. With the pipes destroyed and the surface water frozen or contaminated by corpses, they were forced to drink from toilet cisterns in ruined apartments or risk their lives crawling out at night to scoop up snow. They suffered from scurvy, blindness caused by the perpetual darkness, and a crushing loneliness. The most famous of these was the pianist W. Ladislaw Szpilman, whose survival in an attic in the center of the city became a legend. But there were others whose names are lost to history. There were groups who created miniature societies underground, maintaining military discipline in a single cellar, waiting for a liberation that seemed like it would never come. When the Soviets finally rolled into the city in mid-January 1945, these survivors emerged like creatures from another planet. They were covered in sores, their eyes sensitive to the light, their vocal cords atrophied from months of whispering. They crawled out to meet the Red Army soldiers, weeping not just with relief, but with the sheer shock of seeing other human beings. However, the arrival of the Soviets did not bring the freedom that the Warsaw insurgents had fought for. It brought a new, colder reality. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, followed closely behind the frontline troops. They were not interested in the ruins. They were interested in the political landscape. They established their headquarters in the Praga district on the East Bank, which had survived relatively intact. From there, they began the systematic hunt for the members of the Home Army. The tragedy of the Polish resistance was that their heroism became their crime. To the Soviet occupiers, the soldiers who had fought the Germans were not allies, but reactionary bandits and obstacles to the communist takeover of Poland. The officers who had led the uprising, those who had survived the German camps or who had evaded capture, were invited to negotiations with the Soviet command. In March 1945, 16 of the most senior leaders of the Polish underground state, including General Leopold Okulicki, the successor to Bor Komorowski, were invited to a villa in Pruskow for talks with Marshal Zhukov. It was a trap. They were arrested, drugged, and flown immediately to Moscow to be imprisoned in the Lubyanka prison. This event, known as the Trial of the 16, was a show trial designed to decapitate the Polish independence movement. While the Western Allies celebrated the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, the leaders of the nation that had been the first to fight Hitler were sitting in Soviet cages, accused of collaborating with the Nazis, a lie so grotesque it stunned the Polish population. They were sentenced to long prison terms in the Gulag. Many, including General Okulicki, would die in Soviet captivity, murdered or succumbing to the harsh conditions. Meanwhile, back in the ruins of Warsaw, a spontaneous and chaotic migration was beginning. The civilians who had been driven out in October began to return. They came on foot, pulling handcarts, hitching rides on military trucks, walking hundreds of miles in the snow. They were drawn back by a primal instinct to return to their patch of earth. What they found broke their hearts all over again. Most could not even find the street where they had lived, let alone their house. They found only mounds of red brick dust. Yet almost immediately, life began to reassert itself with a stubborn, weed-like tenacity. In the midst of the lunar landscape, people set up shop. A woman would clear a square meter of pavement, set up a wooden crate, and start selling hot soup or cigarettes. A barber would salvage a chair, place it in the middle of a ruined courtyard under the open sky, and hang a sign saying, "Business open." Families moved into the ground floors of buildings that had lost their upper stories, patching the holes in the ceiling with corrugated iron and tar paper. They lived without electricity, heat, or water, huddled together against the Polish winter, but they were home. The new communist government, installed by Stalin, initially considered abandoning Warsaw entirely. The destruction was so total that planners seriously debated leaving the ruins as a permanent anti-war memorial and moving the capital to the industrial city of Lodz, which had survived the war largely intact. But the people of Warsaw made the decision for them. By returning in their thousands and starting to clear the rubble with their bare hands, they forced the government's hand. Warsaw would be rebuilt. The reconstruction of Warsaw is an epic of human will that rivals the uprising itself. It was a project of unprecedented scale. The Biuro Odbudowy Stolicy, or the Capital Reconstruction Bureau, was formed. It employed thousands of architects, engineers, and historians. Their task was to resurrect a ghost. The decision was made to rebuild the old town and the royal route not as they were immediately before the war, but in their idealized historical form. Since the blueprints had been destroyed by the Germans, the architects turned to art. They used the 18th-century cityscape paintings of the Italian artist Bernardo Bellato, known as Canaletto the Younger, as their primary reference. They studied his meticulous details of cornices, roof lines, and windows to recreate the facades of the townhouses. It was a forensic reconstruction. The citizens of Warsaw participated en masse. It became a civic duty. Every Sunday, thousands of volunteers, students, factory workers, clerks, would descend on the ruins to clean bricks. They formed human chains, passing bricks from hand to hand. The mortar that holds the old town together today is mixed with the sweat of the entire generation that survived the war. However, the reconstruction was also a political tool. The communists rebuilt the old town to appease the patriotic feelings of the people. But in the rest of the city, they imposed the heavy, brutalist architecture of socialist realism. They widened the streets to allow for military parades and tanks. They built massive, gray housing blocks that dominated the skyline. And in the center of the city, on a vast plot of land cleared of tenement houses, they built the Palace of Culture and Science. This building, a gift from the Soviet Union to the people of Poland, rose like a jagged tooth from the ruins. It was a massive skyscraper in the style of the Seven Sisters in Moscow, a wedding cake tower of sandstone and granite. To the Poles, it was not a gift, it was a symbol of their enslavement. It was a constant, looming reminder that while the German occupier was gone, the Russian overseer remained. For decades, it was said that the best view of Warsaw was from the observation deck of the Palace of Culture, because that was the only place in the city where you couldn't see the Palace of Culture. While the bricks were being laid, the shadow war continued. The soldiers of the Home Army who had not been arrested faced a life of persecution. They were barred from universities and good jobs. They were interrogated and surveilled. The communist propaganda machine tried to rewrite history. They claimed that the uprising was a cynical plot by the reactionary London government to waste Polish lives. They minimized the role of the Home Army and exaggerated the role of the tiny communist People's Army. For the families of the fallen, this was a second death. They were not allowed to mourn their heroes publicly. The crosses on the insurgent graves were often removed or defaced. To mention the date August 1st in a public speech was an act of rebellion. The history books in schools were censored. A generation of Polish children grew up learning a falsified version of their own history, where the Soviet Union was the sole liberator and the Home Army were portrayed as reckless adventurers or even fascists. But the memory went underground, just as the army had. In private homes, behind closed doors, the truth was whispered. Grandparents told their grandchildren about the barricades, about the sewers, about the boys in the captured German helmets. They preserved the armbands, the medals, and the scraps of paper with orders written on them, hiding them in hollowed-out books or under floorboards. The memory of the uprising became a form of spiritual resistance. It was a kernel of hard, indestructible truth that the communist lies could not dissolve. This suppression of memory lasted for 45 years. It was only with the rise of the Solidarity movement in the 1980s that the truth began to break the surface. The workers in the shipyards of Gdansk, who struck against the communist regime, saw themselves as the spiritual heirs of the Warsaw insurgents. They used the same symbol, the kotwica, the anchor, the emblem of the Home Army fighting Poland, spray-painted on the walls of the shipyards. When martial law was declared in Poland in 1981, and tanks once again rolled through the streets of Warsaw to crush a freedom movement, the echoes of 1944 were deafening. The people knew how to resist because their parents had taught them. They knew how to organize underground because it was in their blood. When communism finally collapsed in 1989, one of the first acts of the Free Polish government was to honor the veterans of the uprising. The monuments were built, the museums were opened, the books were rewritten. The surviving soldiers, now old men and women in their 70s and 80s, were finally able to put on their armbands and march through the streets of their capital, receiving the salute of a free Polish army. It was a moment of profound closure, a healing of a wound that had festered for half a century. Today, the Warsaw Uprising Museum stands in the Wola district, near the site of the worst massacres. It is a place of shadows and sounds. You can hear the thumping of a heartbeat, the sound of Stuka dive bombers, the whispers of the insurgents. It is designed not just to inform, but to disturb. It forces the visitor to confront the impossible choices that faced the leadership. Was it worth it? Was the destruction of the city and the death of 200,000 people a price worth paying for a moral victory? It is a question that has no easy answer. Historians still argue over the strategic wisdom of the order to rise. Critics argue that it decimated the flower of Polish youth, the future intelligentsia, leaving the nation leaderless and vulnerable to Soviet domination. Defenders argue that without the uprising, Poland would have become just another compliant Soviet satellite republic, without the fierce, independent spirit that eventually drove the wedge that broke the Iron Curtain. They argue that Stalin would have purged the Polish leadership anyway, and that the uprising at least proved to the world that Poland did not consent to its subjugation. But if you ask the survivors, the answer is often simpler. They will tell you that they had to fight. After 5 years of terror, of roundups, of public executions, the desire for freedom was a physical need, like hunger or thirst. They will tell you that for those 63 days, despite the hunger, the filth, and the death, they were free. They were citizens of a free Republic of Poland, existing in a pocket of defiance in the middle of a totalitarian continent. And that feeling of freedom, however fleeting, was something that no one could take away from them. The landscape of modern Warsaw is a palimpsest of this history. In the courtyards of the pre-war tenements that survived in the Praga district, you can still see the bullet scars on the red brick walls, preserved as shrines. You can find small shrines to the Virgin Mary in the backyards, where residents prayed during the bombing. In the meticulously rebuilt old town, if you look closely at the walls, you can sometimes see the scorch marks on the original bricks that were salvaged from the fire. There is a hill in Warsaw, the Warsaw Uprising Mound, located in the Czerniakow district. It is an artificial hill, created entirely from the rubble of the destroyed city. Millions of tons of broken bricks, concrete, and human ash were trucked there in the years after the war to clear the streets. It is literally a mountain made of the dead city. Today it is covered in grass and trees. A monument stands at the top, a symbol of the fighting Poland. To climb, it is to walk on the physical remains of 1944. It is a peaceful place now, offering a panoramic view of the glittering glass skyscrapers of the modern financial district, a city that has risen, phoenix-like, from the very debris beneath your feet. The story of the Warsaw Uprising is ultimately a universal one. It is the story of the fragile, precious nature of civilization. It reminds us that the cities we live in, the comforts we enjoy, the laws that protect us are not guaranteed. They can be swept away in a moment of madness, but it is also a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. It teaches us that even in the deepest darkness, when all hope seems lost, when the world has turned its back, there is still value in dignity, in courage, and in the refusal to bow down to tyranny. As the narrator of this history, I leave you with one final image. It is the image of the little insurgent, a statue that stands today outside the walls of the old town. It depicts a small boy, perhaps 10 years old, wearing a helmet that is too large for his head, clutching a submachine gun. It honors the child soldiers of Warsaw. It is a heartbreaking monument, small and low to the ground. It does not glorify war, it mourns the loss of innocence. It stands as a silent guardian, watching over the rebuilt walls, a permanent reminder of the cost of freedom. The wind blows through the streets of Warsaw today, carrying the sounds of a modern European capital, the trams, the chatter of tourists, the music from cafes. But if you listen closely in the quiet moments of the dawn or the dusk, you can still hear the echo. The echo of the boots on the cobblestones, the echo of the barricades, the echo of a city that died and lived again. While the chronological narrative of the Warsaw Uprising provides the framework of the tragedy, the true depth of those 63 days lies in the specific, intimate details that often escape the broad sweep of history. To fully understand the texture of the battle, one must look closer at the forgotten episodes, the unsung units, and the human machinery that kept the resistance alive against impossible odds. This final chapter serves as an epilogue, a collection of essential vignettes that illuminate the shadows of the ruins. One of the most extraordinary and cinematic moments of the entire uprising occurred early on, during the first week of August, in the district of Wola. It was an event that linked the tragedy of the Jewish Holocaust with the Polish insurrection in a moment of shared liberation. In the heart of the city stood the Gzioka concentration camp. It was a secondary camp to the infamous Powiak prison, holding Jews from across Europe, Greece, Hungary, France, who were being used as slave labor to salvage valuables from the ruins of the former Jewish ghetto, which had been destroyed the previous year. On August 5th, the elite Zaska Battalion of the Home Army, a unit composed largely of Boy Scouts who had matured into hardened soldiers, launched an assault on the camp. But they did not attack on foot alone. In a stroke of immense fortune, they had captured 2 German Panther tanks earlier in the fighting. One of these tanks, renamed Magda, was repaired by Polish mechanics and crewed by insurgents who had quickly learned the controls. Imagine the scene. A German tank, painted with the Polish Kotwicka anchor, roaring down the street, crashing through the heavy iron gates of a Nazi concentration camp. The German SS guards, stunned by the sight of their own armor turning against them, were overwhelmed by the supporting infantry. In a matter of minutes, the camp was liberated. 348 Jewish prisoners were freed. The scenes of joy were indescribable. Men and women in striped camp uniforms, emaciated and terrified, wept as they embraced the young Polish soldiers who had burst in from the smoke. Many of these liberated Jews immediately asked for weapons. They joined the uprising, fighting alongside their liberators in the ruins of the old town. It was a rare, shining moment of absolute victory, a glimpse of what the uprising was fighting for, the breaking of chains. While the soldiers fought with guns, another battle was waged with words. The importance of the radio station Błyskawica, or lightning, cannot be overstated. In a city cut off from the world, where German propaganda blared constantly that the uprising had failed, the Błyskawica transmitter was the heartbeat of truth. The station was mobile, constantly moved from basement to avoid German radio direction finding teams who would triangulate the signal and call in airstrikes. The broadcasters were civilians, journalists, actors, and announcers. They sat in damp, candle-lit cellars, speaking into primitive microphones while mortar shells shook dust from the ceiling onto their scripts. They broadcast news in Polish, English, German, and French. They sent desperate pleas to London and Washington. "We are fighting for freedom," they would say, their voices crackling over the static. "Do not forget us." For the civilians trapped in the dark, tuning in to Błyskawica on secret crystal radio sets was a religious ritual. It was the proof that they still existed, that the Polish state was still functioning. When the station finally went silent on October 4th after the surrender, the announcer signed off with a line that broke the city's heart. "Radio lightning is ceasing its work. Our muffled voice will not reach you. Farewell, The cultural loss of the uprising is another dimension often buried under the military statistics. The generation that fought in the streets was the generation of the Columbuses, born after Poland regained independence in 1918. They were the first generation to be educated in free Polish schools. They were the country's future poets, writers, and scientists. The most tragic symbol of this lost potential was Krzysztof Kamil Baczynski. Baczynski was 23 years old, a poet of immense talent, already recognized as the voice of his generation. His poetry was visionary, filled with catastrophic imagery, as if he foresaw his own doom. He was a soldier in the Parasol Battalion. On the fourth day of the uprising, August 4th, he was in the Blanka Palace near the Old Town. He peeked out of a window to observe the German positions. A German sniper, waiting for just such a movement, shot him in the head. He died instantly. His wife, Barbara, unaware of his death, was killed a few weeks later. In that one bullet, Polish literature lost a future Nobel laureate. He was just one of thousands of students who died with their unwritten books and unpainted canvases locked inside them. The uprising decapitated the Polish intelligentsia, a wound the nation felt for decades. We must also look deeper into the connolly, the sewers, to understand the psychological horror of the communication lines. The guides who led the soldiers through the filth were often women, members of the Little Sewer Unit. These were slight, agile girls who knew the subterranean map by heart. They were the unsung heroines of the underground. They had to memorize the number of steps between manholes, the sound of the water flow, and the smell of different districts. To enter the sewers required a specific mental state. The darkness was absolute. The sensory deprivation caused hallucinations. Soldiers, exhausted from battle, would see lights that weren't there or hear voices in the rushing water. The physical danger was acute. The rapid current of the storm drains could sweep a weakened man off his feet and carry him into the Vistula, where he would drown or be shot by German sentries on the riverbank. The cannelars, the sewer guides, managed the panic of the soldiers. They would hold the hands of the terrified, whispering instructions, leading columns of men through the sludge for hours on end. When they emerged, they were often temporarily blinded by the daylight, their skin bleached white by the lack of sun and the chemical fumes. There is also the story of the airmen, not the Poles, but the foreigners who died trying to save a city they had never seen. The Warsaw Airlift is a chapter of gallantry that binds Poland to South Africa, Britain, and the United States. The flight path from Brindisi in Italy to Warsaw was one of the most dangerous of the war. It required flying low over the Carpathian Mountains and the heavily defended Danube Basin. The losses were staggering. 147 Allied planes were shot down. The South African Air Force, specifically the 31st and 34th Squadrons, paid a particularly heavy price. These young men, volunteers from Johannesburg and Cape Town, flew heavy Liberator bombers at rooftop height over a burning city to drop canisters of ammunition. They described the heat from the fires as being so intense it could be felt inside the cockpit at 1,000 feet. They watched their friends explode in midair, hit by flak. There is a poignant story of a Liberator bomber piloted by Captain Jack Van Eysen. On the night of August 14th, his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Warsaw. With 2 engines on fire and the controls failing, he ordered the crew to bail out. He managed to crash land the burning giant in a park in the Praga district. He survived, badly burned, and was taken prisoner by the Soviets, who treated him with suspicion rather than as an ally. The wreckage of these planes, scattered across Poland, served as metallic monuments to the international effort to aid the uprising, an effort that was brave but tragically insufficient. We should also touch upon the tactical evolution of the insurgents. Lacking anti-tank weapons, they developed a unique method of hunting tanks. They formed tank hunter teams. These were usually the youngest, fastest soldiers. They would wrap their feet in rags to move silently. They would wait in the rubble of a first-floor window until a German tank passed directly underneath. Then they would drop a bundle of grenades or a Molotov cocktail onto the rear engine deck. It required nerves of steel to let a 40-ton monster rumble within a few feet of your hiding spot before striking. The insurgents also manufactured their own weapons in secret workshops. The Błyskawica submachine gun was designed and built in Warsaw during the occupation. It was a crude, ugly weapon, welded together from water pipes and sheet metal, but it fired 9mm rounds and it worked. It was the only mass-produced weapon designed and built in occupied Europe. Holding one of these guns was a point of immense pride. It was a physical manifestation of Polish engineering and defiance. Finally, we must consider the animals of the uprising. As the starvation set in, the city's horses were the first to be eaten, but the bond between the soldiers and the animals remained. There were dogs that served as mascots, sensing the incoming artillery shells before the humans could hear them, barking warnings that saved lives. In the final days, as the city was being abandoned, the heartbreaking sight of thousands of pets, cats and dogs, left behind in the ruins, sitting on the rubble of their former homes waiting for masters who would never return, was a final, quiet tragedy that haunted many survivors. As we step back and view the Warsaw Uprising in its totality, it stands as a singular event in World War II. It was the largest single military operation undertaken by any European resistance movement. It was an urban battle that lasted longer than the invasion of Poland in 1939 or the Battle of France in 1940. The legacy of the uprising is not found in the victory, for there was none. It is found in the myth of Warsaw. This myth suggests that there are values higher than biological survival. It posits that a life lived in slavery is not a life worth living. The insurgents of 1944 sent a message to the future, that Poland belongs to the Poles and that they are willing to burn their capital to the ground to prove it. This spirit, tempered in the fire of August and September 1944, became the bedrock of the Polish character in the second half of the 20th century. When the workers of Solidarity stood up to the communist regime in 1980, they were not starting a new fight. They were picking up the flag that had been dropped in the rubble in 1945. So, as the final image of this narration, do not picture the ruins. Picture the day after the war ended. Picture a single woman, wearing a gray coat, walking into the sea of bricks that was once Marszałkowska Street. She is carrying a shovel. She finds a spot where her house used to be. She does not weep. She sticks the shovel into the rubble and begins to dig. She is looking for a photograph, a cup, a piece of her life. And then she begins to stack the bricks. One by one, she is starting the long, slow work of rebuilding the world. This is the true end of the story. Not the destruction, but the stubborn, unstoppable return of life.